Hey students, welcome back. And today we are going to get into Chapter 12, Liberalism at High Tide in California History. And this is going to be the final chapter of this semester that we're going to cover. So let's begin by looking at the key terms. So for this chapter, there was a lot of really interesting parts to this chapter. Recommend that you read it. However, I'm going to focus on the aspect of this time period of California history. I am going to talk a little bit about entertainment and media, sports and amusement parks because they become a real big part of the identity of the state of California. But then we're going to get into talking about activist groups, the United Farm Workers, the Raza Movement, the LA Unified Walkouts, the Watts Riots, the Black Panthers. These are all big social movements that are going to have major impacts, not just here in the state of California, but of course all over the country. So California really becomes kind of the symbol, the icon of these different social movements as they emerge in the 1960s and 1970s. Okay, so now before we begin talking about social movements, we're going to talk about California and entertainment. And entertainment in California kind of reflects the trends that are happening throughout the nation. So we're talking about a time period post World War II America where the baby boom generation is coming of age. They're becoming young adults. And they had grown up in an environment of relative affluence in the post-war years. You do have the growth of middle-class America, but you also had this underlying continuation of prejudice and racial discrimination and, Jim Crow laws, segregation, all throughout the country. At the same time, you're also talking about a period of American history that is post-World War II into the Cold War era. So you have people that had lived through this time period of this culture of conformity, this culture of fear. At the same time, there's wars still happening. I mean, World War II was not the end of the wars, right? You've got, of course, the Korean War, which happens from 1950 to 1953. And then you have the war in Vietnam, which begins to escalate right around 1963 and continues to really peak out in terms of troop deployment in about 1968. So you're having these youths growing up in these environments, and you're starting to get more and more of a sense of rebellion as we move forward. And we can see this reflected in the entertainment industry. So you have movies coming out about disaffected youth, people who are unhappy with, their childhoods, unhappy with the culture that they're growing up in, and they're wanting to rebel. They're wanting something different. They're wanting something more. By the time we get to the 1970s, you're also going to see television shows that are going to be addressing some of the social issues of the day, really sort of bringing to the forefront these issues of not only the disaffected youth, but also racial issues, right? And issues of class and economic inequality and those types of things. So we're going to see all of this reflected in the entertainment industry. And of course, a lot of this entertainment is coming out of California and the studios in California. The other thing that's happening in California is we are going to get more sports teams that are going to come to the state. And that begins in 1958 when the LA Dodgers come out from Brooklyn, from New York, and the San Francisco Giants come out from New York as well. So Los Angeles and San Francisco are going to get Major League Baseball teams in 1958. The Lakers are going to come as a basketball team to Los Angeles from Minneapolis in 1960. And then throughout the 1960s, we're going to see football teams come to the state as well. with the LA Rams, the San Francisco 49ers, and the San Diego Chargers. In 1960, Lake Tahoe is going to host the Winter Olympics at Squaw Valley. And this, of course, will put a spotlight on California, an international spotlight on California, and the entertainment opportunities here. California becomes only second to Hawaii in the sport of surfing. So places like Huntington Beach, places like Santa Cruz in California become these places where surfing competitions are going to be held and broadcast on television. And then finally, and very famously, you have the opening of Walt Disney's Disneyland in Anaheim, California. It opens in 1955, and you can see here kind of a time lapse photo. You'll notice on the older photo, you've got Disneyland as it originally was, very much in the middle of this very rural area. So you notice all of the orchards and everything around the park. Now, of course, fast forward to modern times and it's all built up and it's parking lots and everything else. But Disneyland, of course, becomes a major tourist destination. And so people are coming from all over the country and even all over the world to experience these fantasy lands that have been created by Walt Disney. Knott's Berry Farm also becomes a major destination for tourism in the state of California. And then there was also Marineland, which is actually no longer there. But these are amusement parks that become internationally known. And so, of course, tourism is going to increase in the state when we get into the 1950s with the opening of Disneyland in 1955. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about the social movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in the state of California. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is the farm workers, because the farm workers have been such an integral part of the state's economy going all the way back to the very beginnings of the state. And as we get into the 20th century, the agricultural industry in the state of California is going to become very reliant upon migrant farm workers. And migrant farm workers are going to be left out of a lot of the political transformations and the unionization movements of the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. Now, going all the way back to the 1930s, agricultural workers in the state had been trying to unionize, and they had met with massive resistance. The growers in these major agribusiness farms really fought against the unionization of farm workers. And then beginning in 1942, there was the Bracero program. And the Bracero program is going to bring these migrant farm workers into the state and have them stay seasonally and then return to Mexico. And starting in 1942, the Bracero workers make it very difficult for the other migrant workers to unionize because the Braceros are working for a set wage and they often would work for a very low wage, which undermined the ability of other migrant farm workers to make more money. So the Bracero program ends in 1964, and that will allow for the unionization movement of migrant farm workers to really take off. There were also other organizations that were focused on improving conditions for migrant farm workers. The CSO, the Community Service Organization, and MAPA, the Mexican American Political Association, all of these associations and organizations, they work to increase political and civil rights for California's Mexican population. One of the big things was to try to get people registered to vote and also to be able to have multilingual ballots so that you could have official documents that are also written in Spanish. This was really important for a lot of these migrant populations. So, unfortunately, however, these organizations were very political in nature and they didn't focus on the specific needs of the farm workers. And that's where we see Cesar Chavez coming in and helping to organize farm workers beginning in 1962. So we're going to talk now about the founding of the United Farm Workers Association and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. So Cesar Chavez was born in Arizona in 1927, and he had grown up on a piece of land owned by his family for quite some time, but eventually his land was seized by a group of dishonest Anglos, and his family was displaced and ended up having to move to California in 1938 within the context of the Great Depression, a very difficult time to make a living, especially if you were a farm worker family. In 1939, his family moves to San Jose, and in 1942, he graduates the 8th grade. In 1946, he joins the Navy, and in 1948, he marries Helen Fabula, and they move to Delano, California. He becomes very much involved in the CSO, the Community Service Organization, and he is working to try to get Mexicans registered to vote, and that is where he ends up meeting Dolores Huerta. Now, both Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez had come from migrant farm families, and they understood the plight of farm workers as being something separate and different than necessarily just Mexican immigrants that had come to the state. So they wanted to create an organization that dealt specifically with unionizing farm workers, and that's when they came up with the United Farm Workers Association in 1962. And their whole idea was that the farm workers, they needed a voice and they needed a way to have rights when it came to their jobs. They needed a way to negotiate with the growers for increased wages, for better work hours, for better working conditions. So they begin to go door to door and get people to support their cause. But support was very, very slow, and they kept on running into the fact that the Bracero program was still happening, so it undermined their ability to unionize. Of course, in 1964, when the Bracero program ends on a national level, then it allows for the United Farm Workers Association to have a lot more leverage. So that brings us to the Delano Grape Strike of 1965. The Delano Grape Strike was actually started by Filipino grape pickers. And the Filipinos basically were striking because they wanted to make a wage that had been given to the Braceros, which was $1.40 an hour. And they were having a problem having a voice because many of the Filipino farm workers were aging. Many of them had immigrated to the United States in the 1920s and 1930s, and they realized that they really needed the support of the United Farm Workers in order to have a strong voice. So the United Farm Workers will join with the Filipino organizers, and they go on strike in the Delano grape fields in 1965. So here you have an image of Larry Itlong, and he is one of the main Filipino organizers here for the Delano grape strike. And again, they become a very powerful movement because they are joining together these two groups of farm workers, the Filipino organizers and the Mexican organizers. And eventually they come up with a two-pronged strategy. Not only are they going to strike, meaning that they're not going to go to work and they refuse to work in the fields, but they're also going to try to organize a march. And this march is going to be something that will gain major recognition for their movement. So let's talk about that. So one of the most famous actions carried out by the United Farm Workers was this march from Delano to Sacramento to the state capitol building in 1966. This was a direct outcome of the Delano grape strike. So again, the Delano grape strike began with these Filipino farm workers who were organizing. Then they reach out to the Mexican farm workers under the United Farm Workers Association to help them out, to support them in their cause. And they had been striking, and their cause was not getting enough recognition. And so the United Farm Workers and the organizers like Cesar Chavez and Larry Itlong and Dolores Huerta, they come up with this idea to carry out this march. And this march is 100+ mile march all the way across the Central Valley, across the heartland of the state of California, right, where a lot of the agricultural business is being done. And the march over time starts to gain a lot of media attention and a lot of recognition. Some of the organizers of the march were not just the activists, but also the Catholic priests that were supporting these communities of migrant farm workers. And this becomes very much tied with this idea of liberation theology, this idea that the people that were participating in this march were martyrs. They were martyrs on a pilgrimage, and they were martyrs because they had sacrificed their lives. They had worked in these horrific conditions in order to provide food for the nation, in order to provide food for the state. And so it really does become a very powerful symbol of this movement. And eventually they get to the state capitol. By the time they get to the state capitol, thousands of people have actually joined the march. And so when you look at some of the footage, which you can see if you click on that link below, you'll see these massive crowds gathered at the state capitol, where Cesar Chavez and others are going to give speeches about the plights of the farm workers. Ultimately, this march will lead to a massive boycott of grapes across the nation that is also organized by the United Farm Workers. And they're trying to get people to support their cause. And it's becoming more and more successful as time goes on. Ultimately, it's going to lead to the 1975 Agricultural Labor Relations Act. And this is the first law that recognizes the right of farm workers to collective bargain, meaning the right of farm workers to be able to determine their contracts, their labor contracts. So this movement that began back in 1962 with the founding of the United Farm Workers will eventually gain some, not just national recognition, but also they will gain policy recognition with the passing of the 1975 Agriculture Labor Relations Act, which allows then for farm workers to be able to organize, be able to unionize. So one of the organizations that was working to promote the National Farm Workers Association, the United Farm Workers Association, and also other Chicana movements was El Teatro Campesino. And the El Teatro is a theater group that went around to various colleges primarily and put on these skits and these performances that encourage people to get more socially active and also just to raise general awareness about social justice issues for Latinos. And they were very active down here in Southern California. They were active actually here in the Coachella Valley as well. So this is a little bit of local history as well. So just a lot of awareness, like movement to try to raise awareness about cultural pride, about issues, workers' issues, and also about racial injustices and inequality. Which leads us to our next movement that we're going to talk about, and that's the La Raza movement. The La Raza movement actually began in Texas, but very quickly spread to California. And in many ways, it was very similar to the Black Power movement. It was a movement for cultural pride, for Latinos, Chicanos, self-sufficiency, the idea of rewriting history to include, to be more inclusive. There was also a very strong movement against police brutality, particularly in urban areas like East Los Angeles, where you had a lot of instances of police brutality against the Mexican population. You start to see a movement with the Brown Berets. They were called the Brown Berets, and it was very similar to the Black Panther movement in that they formed police watch groups that would go out and follow police officers while they were on patrol in East Los Angeles and Boyle Heights and places like that, to ensure that the police officers weren't committing acts of police brutality. So this whole idea of empowering minority populations, and also a demand to relook at and reevaluate the historic narrative so that people like Chicanos, people like Mexicans, people like Latinos are included in the historic narrative. And particularly here in the state of California, where you have stamped on the landscape so much Spanish and Mexican heritage that you really can't deny it as being part of the history of our state. And so this was a real demand to take a look at that and include that type of information in the curriculum in schools. So the La Raza movement was a very important movement for cultural pride for Chicano, Latino populations throughout the Southwest and here, of course, in California as well. And as an extension of the La Raza movement was a very famous protest that took place in 1968 called the LA Unified Walkouts. And this is when thousands of high school students from across East Los Angeles walk out of their classrooms to protest the racial biases that is ingrained in the curriculum, the poor infrastructures of the schools, which were deteriorated and in very bad shape, and also the tracking of Latino students. So a lot of the students were encouraged to go into skill-based education instead of actual academics. So there was a lot of, encouraging of young men, for example, to take, wood shop or auto shop or things like of that nature, which is not a bad thing, but it is trying to push, Latinos into a certain type of job market and not encouraging them to pursue higher education. So the Brown Berets are actually going to be partly responsible for organizing this walkout, as are some of the teachers. Keep in mind that a lot of these high schools are, run basically by white administrators and white teachers. And in the entire structure of the institution really was out of touch with the population that they served. And so these the LA Unified Walkouts served as a wake-up call to administrators and to teachers that the population that they serve are very important and they need to be more culturally sensitive to that population. And this was very effective. Again, like a lot of these other protest movements, it gains a lot of media attention. It becomes very powerful symbolically, and it will ultimately lead to some very important reforms when it comes to the ways in which curriculum is taught and also the way in which funding is allocated to the school systems, so that the barrios, the East Los Angeles neighborhoods and school systems will not be left out of the funding of, and that's what was happening. That's why infrastructure was falling apart. So if you click on the link here, it will take you to a documentary about the LA Unified Walkouts, the list of demands that the students gave to the LA Unified School Board that they wanted to see, that the changes that they wanted to see. So again, very important, very powerful movement that will result in some significant changes. So again, here's some more images of the walkouts, and one of the most important things that it does is it starts this dialogue about discrimination, about the fact that the education system was lacking in curriculum that was inclusive, and this will inspire Chicano studies programs throughout the nation, and it also serves to politicize a lot of these marginalized communities. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about a very famous event in California history, the Watts Riots of 1965. This happens in the African American South Central LA community, and basically it's going to begin in a very similar way. You might ring some bells if you're familiar with the Rodney King riots of 1992. This in some ways started in a very similar fashion. In 1965, August 11th, 1965, a 21-year-old Marquette Fry, an African-American man, was behind the wheel of his mother's 1955 Buick. He was pulled over for reckless driving by a white California Highway Patrol motorcycle officer. After administering a field sobriety test, the officer placed Fry under arrest and radioed for his vehicle to be impounded. Marquette's brother, Roland, a passenger in the vehicle, walked to their house nearby, bringing their mother, Raina Price, back with him. Okay, because Raina Price did not want her vehicle to be impounded. She reaches the scene and she scolds Fry for drinking and driving, but what happens is she is asking the police to not impound her vehicle, and the police officer insists upon impounding the vehicle, and basically it becomes a violent confrontation between Fry's mother and the police officer, and Marquette Fry and the police officers. And it escalates to the point where not only is his mom going to be arrested, but the brothers, both Marquette and his brother, will be arrested as well. And so when this happens, a crowd is gathering around, and the police are going to come to break up the crowd, but they will be attacked by rocks and concrete thrown at them. And basically what you're going to see is a combat zone that is going to break out in the city of Watts for the next 6 days. When it is all said and done, there will be 3,400 plus arrests. There will be over 1,000 injuries to people and 34 deaths. The cost of the damage, the property damage, will be somewhere around $40 million. So, what was happening was this, of course, tension in these African American communities, these impoverished communities, between the community members and the law enforcement officers. And this is an ongoing thing that we see is going to reoccur in 1992. It was a little bit different in 1992. In that particular case with Rodney King, you had police officers that were caught on videotape beating up Rodney King when he was being arrested. And then eventually those police officers will be acquitted, and that will set off a series of riots in 1992. But what the Watts riots showed was that despite the progress that had been made on the national level with the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, there was still a lot of issues yet to be resolved. There was still a lot of discrimination, and particularly when it came to law enforcement and it came to police brutality and these tense interactions that were a regular occurrence in these impoverished communities. So the Watts riots will lead to 6 days of property damage, of looting. Eventually, the National Guard will be called in to put down the riots. And this also kind of shows the split in the civil rights movement as well, because Martin Luther King, who was very much for peaceful acts of civil disobedience, thought that this was a horrible thing that was happening, and he actually asked the rioters to stop. And for a lot of those rioters, they felt as if he was betraying them, that he didn't really understand their cause and their frustration. And one thing about riots, even though, of course, they cause a lot of damage and they're in some ways counterproductive, they do demonstrate that there is a problem, right? Riots don't just happen for no reason. And so it's very important to recognize that. And that was certainly true with the Watts riots in 1965, and it was also true in 1992 with the Rodney King riots. So if you click on this link, it will take you to a newsreel about the Watts riots. And what's really interesting is when you watch this newsreel, this is a newsreel that would have been shown all throughout the country. So people would have seen this, and this is what they would have known about the Watts riots. One of the things that you should pay attention to on this newsreel is that there is one thing that is clearly missing from the newsreel, and that's why are these riots happening? Why is this community as upset as it is? It doesn't even go there. It doesn't even address that. None of the rioters are interviewed. Nobody is interviewed from the actual community. And so it really does give the impression that there's just this overwhelming lawlessness without really talking about the underlying causes, which is the really important thing to keep in mind, and especially if you don't want it to happen again. Okay, so this leads to the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is the Black Power movement. And here in California, when you talk about the Black Power movement, really the most iconic group for that is the Black Panthers, that were founded in 1966 by two college students, Merritt College students in Oakland, California, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And they found this organization, the full name for the organization is the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And one of their primary objectives is to bring about awareness of problems when it comes to discrimination in employment, discrimination in housing, the ongoing problem of police brutality, The fact that communities, impoverished communities, are often disenfranchised, they don't have a political voice, and they also wanted to address and change the way that history was taught. So a lot of the issues of the Black Power movement fall right in line with the Chicano movement, the La Raza movement, wanting to see a change in society, but also wanting to see an increase in consciousness. They wanted Black people that had been falsely convicted to be released from prison. Now, the reason why they called themselves the Black Panther Party for self-defense is they believed in creating these citizen patrol groups. And just like the Brown Berets, they went off to create police watch groups that would follow police on patrol and ensure that they were not committing acts of police brutality. One of the things that the Black Panthers don't give enough credit for is their social programs. They put in place a lot of social programs, including after school and free breakfast programs. So after school, like lunch food programs and free breakfast programs in the morning. They organized community clinics, voter registration drives. They lobbied for education and prison reform. But they did have a lot of confrontations with police. They did hold very public demonstrations like the one you see here in this photograph in 1969 of them in front of the Capitol building in Sacramento, where they demand access to hearings on gun control, and they wanted to be able to show their Second Amendment right. And this made people feel very uncomfortable to see Black men armed in public. And the whole idea was because they wanted to show a sense of power, and they wanted to show a sense of defensiveness, that they wanted to be able to have a sense of community empowerment. So by the 1970s, the organization was kind of falling apart because of the imprisonment of a lot of the leadership of the group. This is because the Black Panthers were basically put on the FBI's #1 watch list, and they were infiltrated. Their organization was infiltrated by undercover FBI agents. And so a lot of their leadership will eventually be imprisoned, some of them on false charges. But their accomplishments were that they had a lasting impact on community empowerment, not just here in California and Black communities in California, but also Black communities throughout the nation. The Black Panther Party became popular in major cities throughout the country. They also are empowering a Black electorate, so they did politicize a lot of the Black community. They encouraged ethnic studies programs, and again, their police watch groups, which actually are still in existence today in places like Berkeley and Oakland here in California. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talk about another movement in California. Yes, there are a lot of them. They're all very important in their own way. So the Berkeley free speech movement, which begins in the early 1960s. And so to understand the Berkeley free speech movement, you really need to understand the Students for a Democratic Society, also acronym is SDS. And the Students for a Democratic Society was a student club that emerges throughout the country in the early 1960s. And in 1962, they put out a public statement called the Port Huron Statement. This was basically came out of a conference that they had in upstate New York. And what it said was that they wanted to be a student organization that was committed to participatory democracy, meaning that students, young people, should have access not only to the vote, but to different types of political ideas. that they should have access to lots of different ideas politically, social movements, that they also needed to participate directly in the political process. That includes things like initiatives and referendums and recalls. So they very much believed in this idea of citizen groups putting bills on the ballot for voting for citizens to be able to vote. They believed in having an educated electorate. And so what you're going to see at UC Berkeley is this free speech movement that's going to emerge because the UC regents, which basically control the whole University of California system, had put restrictions on who could come to the UC campuses and present information. So they didn't want any political radical groups, whatever they viewed as political radical groups, to come onto campus and distribute information. And the students found out that this was happening and they began to protest it. So that's what you're seeing here. This is an image of the UC Berkeley campus and the free speech movement. And you'll notice that, this is a very, it looks very tame. The students are dressed very sort of professionally. You see the boys are wearing, suits. And so this movement is going to radicalize as time moves on. SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, are actually going to turn their attention more towards anti-war action as we get into the late 1960s in response to the Vietnam War. But as we get into the late 1960s, this same activist group, as I said, as it begins to transform and morph into different activist groups, in 1969, they're going to take over an empty lot owned by the UC, owned by the regents of the UC. And this was an empty lot along Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, which is right next to where the university is. And they decided that these student activists decided that they were going to go into this empty lot and they were going to set up a park, and they named it People's Park. And they set up gardens, they set up playgrounds, etc. And a month after this happens, the university tries to come back and take the park from what they considered these squatters. So the police come, the UC cops come, they clear the park, they put a fence around it, and then people begin to demonstrate against the fact that they don't have access to this park. And these demonstrations become very, very large. And this is happening in 1969. And it is in many ways an extension of this Berkeley free speech movement. As I said, this really begins the tradition of activism at UC Berkeley. So at the time that this happens, 1961, Ronald Reagan is the governor of California. And he decides that he is going to send in the National Guard to put down this protest movement for the parks. And it becomes a very violent confrontation. One person was blinded by buckshot that was shot by the National Guard. One guy died, a man by the name of James Rector, and more than 100 people were injured. If you click on this link, it will take you to some of the news footage and everything of these protests for People's Park. So this protest is violently put down by Governor Reagan, 1969. In 1972, a group of protesters during an anti-war protest, and they were protesting against Vietnam, they took back the park and they tore down the fence. And the Berkeley City Council decides to vote to lease the park and be responsible for its upkeep. So eventually People's Park will become a public park leased by the city of Berkeley, leased from the UC, from UC Berkeley. But it's a kind of an interesting demonstration of the power of the people. It shows how the UC Berkeley protest movement begins as this free speech movement, but then really morphs itself into an anti-war movement and a movement to protest like access to parks, and then eventually they end up getting People's Park. And I recommend visiting People's Park if you ever go to Berkeley, because now that you know the history of People's Park, you might appreciate it a little bit more. Okay, so we are going to turn our attention now to talking about the counterculture in California. And this is one of the things that is really important to understand when it comes to the history of California, is, this idea of California really being the origin of the counterculture movement. And it begins really in the 1950s with the Beatniks, and the Beatniks were a group of um, poets and writers and artists who were really rejecting a lot of that culture of conformity and fear of the 1950s. They were a small group in the 1950s, and eventually that group is going to morph into the much larger counterculture movement of the 1960s. You can't really talk about the 1960s and LSD without talking about Timothy Leary, who was somebody who was very much involved in promoting the use of LSD. So Timothy Leary will get his PhD in clinical psychology from Berkeley in the 1950s. And he goes on to be a lecturer, professor at Harvard University. And he had kind of a hard road. He became a very intense alcoholic, and his wife actually committed suicide. And in 1960, he begins to experiment with this drug, LSD. So LSD had been around since the 1930s. It was originally synthesized in the Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland by a man by the name of Albert Hofmann. That was in 1938. And then eventually LSD kind of becomes like a possible psychotropic drug, one that could be used to potentially treat depression or bipolar disease or whatever. So it was being used experimentally. Keep in mind that at the time that Timothy Leary begins to conduct these experiments with LSD, LSD is not illegal. It's legal. So if you are a clinical psychologist, you have access to this drug and you can conduct experiments, and especially if you are a professor at Harvard. So in 1960 and beginning in 1960, he begins to do these series of experiments. And through his own use of LSD and through his experimental observations, he begins to believe that this drug is like a wonder drug. Eventually, he's going to be fired because he kind of, goes off the deep end, and he's not really paying attention to his teaching duties and all of that. So he eventually will be fired in 1963. But after that, he begins to promote LSD as this wonder drug. And, he's convinced that this is a wonder drug. He had stopped being an alcoholic as a result of his LSD use. And he starts this movement, turn on, tune in, and drop out. And it becomes kind of like the mantra in many ways of the counterculture movement as we get into the late 1960s. So in 1964, a California-based group called the Merry Pranksters will really start to embrace this LSD drug and this LSD culture. And they create a bus that they nickname Further. It's a school bus. They painted all these various colors, and they decide that they are going to go on a tour across the country giving what they called acid tests. Now, these were LSD based tests, or more like parties, where they would distribute LSD, usually in the form of Kool-Aid. And then they would, play bands, and it would be like an all-night party. And they called it an acid test because you were supposed to pass the acid test by going through this transformative experience through this process. And the Merry Pranksters become pretty famous across the country, but they were their home was in California, in San Francisco, and also in a small commune in La Honda, which was in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And this really becomes kind of like the icon for counterculture freedom, because here you have a group of young people who are boarding this school bus. They're traveling throughout the country. They're doing these acid tests. Now, at the time that this was happening, acid was still legal, okay? LSD was still legal in the United States. And so there was really nothing that the authorities could necessarily do about this. But again, this does become like the basis of this, gypsy sort of counterculture, free love mentality, breaking away from the chains of the culture of conformity and fear of the 1950s. So one of the leaders of the Merry Pranksters was the famous author Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Sometimes a Great Notion. He was a young man when he was involved with the Merry Pranksters. But here you see a recreation of the Further Bus, and you can see that this whole idea of, this gypsy lifestyle, this very sort of free lifestyle, and again, all based here in California. So because California really becomes the hotbed for the counterculture movement and the use of LSD, LSD is actually going to be made illegal in California in October of 1966. And later on, it will become made illegal throughout the rest of the country. In 1967, the Monterey Pop Festival will be held in Monterey, California. This is the first big major rock festival. This was the original Woodstock, so to speak, and this really becomes the model for festivals, for music festivals moving forward. And even though LSD was made illegal, it continues to be synthesized and distributed throughout the counterculture community. This eventually is going to also lead to the Summer of Love, which takes place in 1967, where you're going to have a bunch of be-ins and love-ins, and the whole idea of, free love and having alternative lifestyles is really very much going to be embraced. Of course, the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco really becomes synonymous with the counterculture movement of the 1960s. So this really does have a major impact on not just California, but the rest of the nation as well. People were coming to California, young people were coming to California kind of on pilgrimages to experience this counterculture lifestyle. And here you see an image of one of those be-ins, love-ins in San Francisco in Golden Gate Park. So I'm going to leave you here with this. This is kind of the end of this segment of the course. There are a lot of other things that we can talk about when it comes to California history, and particularly liberalism and the influence that California has on the rest of the country. But for now, I think this is a good place to end. I also want to talk about a couple of other really important movements that happened in California, including the American Indian movement and the occupation of Alcatraz. I want to mention that. I also want to mention the gay rights movement, which also has a very strong following in California, although that really does begin in New York. It does have a very strong presence in California as well, and particularly in San Francisco. So California really becomes like the icon, the beacon for change as we get into the latter half of the 20th century. And even though it really had been that for a while during the progressive era, it went through a lot of transformations in the meantime, and it doesn't really take up that sort of beacon of change and progressivism until we get again back into the 1960s and 1970s. Today, California does have the sixth largest economy in the world. We're essentially like a miniature country. We also are a beacon of environmental laws, very different than a lot of other parts of the United States. With the President of the United States, Trump, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, California has made a commitment to continue its commitment to reducing carbon emissions and to try to, have as light of a carbon footprint as possible, which is challenging considering the fact that California is the most populous state in the nation. So California moving into the 20th century, again, is going to become really, I think, an example of how to move forward and progress into the future. Of course, we deal with a lot of challenges as well, but California continues to be an example of how to move into the future in a progressive manner. And I think in that way, we can all be proud of the state that we live in. In addition to that, it is also a very diverse place, and always has been. And I hope that you learn that through this course, that this state is a wonderful melting pot of different cultures, and each of the cultures in California have contributed greatly to the history and the foundation of this beautiful state that we live in. All right, guys, that's it for this semester. Take care, and if you have any questions, let me know. I will be available via Zoom or through email. All right, take care. Bye.